Let's take a moment now to talk about syntax. What the heck are we doing with all of these indents, brackets, spaces, and semicolons? Let's first talk about brackets and indentations. Open and close brackets are used to surround blocks of code that are running inside of its scope. For example, our trigger loop is running inside the scope of our trigger. Our main trigger logic is running inside the scope of our loop. These blocks of code are indented inside the brackets to show which scope they belong to. Your code scope is important because it defines the context your code is running in. Again, our main trigger logic in lines 3 and 4 is running inside the scope of our trigger loop. So our trigger loop basically owns these lines of code and defines when and how they are run. In this case, the lines of code are repeated for every record in our loop. Taking one more step out, our trigger loop is running inside the context of our overall trigger. Our trigger defines when this code is run, and in this case, it's whenever a lead is updated. It is not mandatory to have your blocks of code indented within its scope, but it's something every programmer does to make sure their code is easily read. Keep your code clean and make sure to use proper indenting. You're going to confuse yourself otherwise. One more note about scope. For every open bracket, there must be a closing bracket. So if you did your indentations properly, all your blocks of code should line up neatly just like this. I'm personally fanatic about keeping my code clean. And if you ever code for a big company like Google, literally every space must be perfect. So start good habits early. The next thing I want to talk about is spaces. Salesforce is flexible with your use of spaces, just as they are flexible with their use of indentations. Whether you use a single space or 100 spaces in a row, Salesforce treats them both the same way. This can be useful if you're a neat freak like me and you're obsessive about keeping your code properly aligned. You may have noticed I used 2 spaces here to make sure the equal signs line up vertically. This code is gorgeous. Finally, let's talk semicolons. The rule of thumb is, if a line of code doesn't end with an open or close bracket, it must end with a semicolon. I guarantee you're going to forget at least one semicolon every time you write a trigger. That's just a fact of life. Whew! We just covered a ton of concepts in a short amount of time. Take a moment to enjoy completing your very first trigger. You never quite forget the moment, and hopefully you'll look back on this time and smile. In the rest of this module, we're going to reinforce the concepts we've covered and show you similar triggers from slightly different angles. At this point, you should be feeling drunk on knowledge. But if you're feeling overwhelmed, rewatch this past section before moving on.